So we made it about halfway through the handout. If you have it, it says page 1 at the top right. So this is the beginning of a brand new locus of study where we're talking about God revealing himself, God's revelation. And we're still kind of in the preliminary stages because we're really driving toward a deeper study of God's special revelation, which would be his speaking to us today, obviously, in the Word, in the Bible that we have. So that's a special revelation. But as you can see on this page, we're going to be talking about the general revelation of God. And that's what we introduced last week. And as you can see, of course, at the big Roman numeral 2, it just says general revelation right there toward the middle of your page. And you see the subpoints A, B, and C. A says there are two senses in which we can call it general revelation. Letter B says there are two avenues of this general revelation. And letter C says there are some functions of this general revelation. In other words, what is the purpose of it? So we're going to talk about that this morning. But as a review there at letter A, the two senses in which we might say this revelation is general is, anybody remember? Through the creation, which is general in what sense? Number 1 says it's generally available to all men. In other words, it doesn't matter where you live or who you know or who you've ever heard or whatever. It's that you live in the creation of God. And so in that sense, it's generally available to all people at all times in every place. But another one here, number 2, says it reveals general truths about God. Meaning it's not getting to specifics of his will, but it just reveals some general truths. And we looked at Romans 1:20 last week that gave a couple of those that said his eternal power and his theotes is the word in the Greek, and it's unique in the New Testament, but it's translated perhaps in your translation his deity, his Godhead, his divine nature. There's different ways the English translators are trying to get the point across. And I don't guess we need to get back into that, but those are two that are mentioned in Romans 1:20 of these general attributes or general ideas about the Creator. He is eternally powerful. His power has no limit. And of course, now that we live in kind of a scientific age where we have instruments to look off into the stars and we see the vast expanse of this universe, it's really mind-boggling when you just even begin to get into how expansive our universe is. You begin to see a little bit better what might be implied by eternal power. How much power would it take not only to create the universe that we live in, but to keep it going and to sustain it? It's mind-boggling. But anyway, that's some of the stuff we talked about last week. Now I want to get into letters B and C on our outline because now we're going to say and talk about two avenues. So in what way does God reveal himself in general revelation? And you see there are two ways that the Bible tells us anyway. And it's number 1 and 2 there. Creation and conscience. And we've been talking a little bit about creation, and the passages there, Romans 1. Now there are a few others that we can look at, but Romans 1 is really the primary one for a couple of reasons. But one of the main reasons is because this is really Paul's point in beginning the letter of Romans to explain that everybody in every place and at all times have access to God's general revelation through the creation. And that's what Romans 1:18 through following says. So for instance, well, by the way, let's look at the word revelation or reveal. Look at verse 17. He says, in it, and he's been talking about the gospel, in it the righteousness of God is revealed. So God is revealing himself through the gospel in those two verses. And in verse 18, what does it say? The wrath of God is revealed And in the original language, that's a present tense verb, meaning the wrath of God is being revealed. In other words, it's an ongoing thing, and we can actually see it, is what he's going to be getting at through the rest of the chapter, and he'll explain how we can see it. But again, so you see the word revelation in here, revealed. God is revealing himself, and in this rest of this chapter, he's going to focus on the wrath of God that's being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. So God is angry. That's what wrath means. He's angry at people who suppress the truth, who reject the truth that he is the source of, right? Well, what truth? Well, it's all around you, Paul's going to say. Look at verse 19. What may be known of God is, there's the word manifested to them. It means it's evident. So here's a way that God reveals himself. There's evidence. Well, what is it? It's manifested among them because God shows it to them. And here's how he does it, verse 20. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by, and there's the phrase, the things that are made. So that's what we mean when we say the creation. The existence of the material universe reveals that God is there and reveals enough about him that makes us culpable for suppressing his truth in our unrighteousness. And so that's where we get that idea. In fact, in verse 21, he explains a little bit about their suppression of truth. It says, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God. And they weren't thankful to him. And what this did was lead to more and more corruption in their hearts, as it says. And they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So this is that downward slide of those who refuse to acknowledge God and his existence and his authority by the fact that he's the creator. It's a downward slide through our rebellion into darkness and futility and things like that. So that's where Paul begins this grand treatise about what the gospel remedies for us, our sin problem in the book of Romans. But this is where he roots it, in this general revelation through, as we're saying here on our notes, the creation. It says in our notes, little letter A there, the existence of the universe from micro to macro. What do those two words mean? From the tiniest to the biggest. And we talked a little bit about the biggest as far as the expanse of the universe. I remember being in museums or planetariums or whatever that shows some videos about it, and it's like, let's go on a journey from planet Earth to our nearest planet, Mars or whatever, and it talks about how far away Mars is, right? And you're thinking, it talks about if you had to drive in a car, it would take you so many thousands or whatever, hundreds of thousands of years just to get there. And so it really paints that picture for you. Man, that's a long ways away. We're used to seeing it on our textbooks, and it's like, oh, it's just right there. It's just, But, you get that little idea about just how far that is, and it blows our mind. But then they move what? To the next one. And they say, okay, that's like twice as far or something like that. And so it's just an amazing thing. That's the macro idea. Now let's think about the micro idea. And I didn't turn this on. But as it's warming up and turning on, when we talk about micro, I found, just in my regular surfing and stuff this week on the internet, I found some interesting pictures that I thought would be neat to give you an illustration of what we're talking about when we talk about God revealing himself not only in the biggest things that are made, but even in the smallest things. And when this picture comes up, right there, right there, right there, What does that look like? I'm sorry? Well, you're not supposed to know that.
I'm a teacher.
Eileen said a dust mite. So that is a strange looking thing, isn't it? I mean, it almost looks like something that the CGI made for an alien movie, doesn't it? You know, because of the skin. I don't know if you call it skin, but... And then what's that? Looks like his nose, I guess, and his eyes are all poked in, you know, like it's folded in, like a burrito or something. But yeah, that's an animal. Now it's a dust mite, or there's a technical name is a tardigrade. And so it's on a piece of moss in this picture, but it's a really, really tiny thing. But now think about getting into the structures in the face, and look, it's got little claws on it. And so all of those structures are amazingly detailed in their function and in the way that it's able to move and you know, move itself across whatever surface it's on. And like we said, a dust mite means it can be as small as a piece of dust, or actually microscopic, according to the explanation that I had there. But that, again, what the Bible is trying to tell us to do is to remember when we see and come to realize certain things about this in God's creation, what should we immediately be struck with? I'm sorry? Awe, which points to God. It's like it's supposed to cause us to glorify God. Now I know at first we look and we think, that's disgusting. I don't want one of those on me. But really, now when you think about it, it's like, man, that's a beautiful, amazingly complex creature. And it's smaller than a piece of dust. I'm sorry?
Dust.
Yeah, like dust. I can't even read this. I was going to read it, but it just mentions a little bit about it. It's called a tardigrade. But it says here, they are known to be able to go for decades without food or water. They can survive temperatures from near absolute zero to well above the boiling point of water. They can survive pressures from near zero to well above that on the ocean floors, and survive direct exposure to dangerous radiations. And it goes on and talks about some experiments that they've done on these things. But you know, those are just further evidences. What's interesting, of course, is that these are evidences that were not available to people who wrote the Bible. They would have never known about these creatures. Now, they can go out to the savannah or whatever and look at the animals that you can study, and that's to do the same thing. But just with the advancement of our scientific abilities, I think that the point is that it doesn't matter how small you look, or how magnified you look, or how telescopic you look. It all is to say, man, who made this? Who come up with these ideas to create these creatures? So I may be belaboring the point here to you, but I'm just saying that's the stress that I think the Bible puts on general revelation. And those with honest hearts and those who are reflective and self-introspective should be struck with an awe that says, you know, I'm not the reason for my own existence. You know, somebody, some amazing mind created me, and that should provoke our search for him, right? Paul would say in Acts 17, you know, in him we live and move and have our being. And his point there before that was, God did this so that we might search for him and grope for him. So he's intensifying the word there, meaning it should become a lifelong desire to know God better. That's what it means to be somebody who searches for God. And then the Bible promises, Hebrews 11:6, those who believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him can live by faith. Right? They can live successfully. I had another example here. This probably wouldn't strike you the same, but it's about the blue whale being the loudest animal on earth. But as it explains here, it's almost twice as loud as a jet engine. So, you know, you begin to think, I didn't know that. But the way that, it can be under the ocean waters and you can hear it, from on the beach. And that's kind of a reflection of the kind of power and the kind of thing that draws you to, who created that? Who made it real? Here's a cat we've been watching over the last few weeks. I just wanted to put that up there. That face struck me, though. I mean, I never liked cats, and I'm going to tell you right now I still don't, but I do. And I don't want one. But I do. So I don't know what to think about them. But they are amazing. They are amazing. So we will stop that. I think this is what the Bible is pointing at here. Much material is available that discusses the logical proofs for God's existence from the created order in the cosmos. So you can look up various websites. In the Brotherhood, we have one that's very useful, Apologetics Press. And you can go there and they have lots of articles from a scientific perspective that point out these kinds of things in much better detail than I have. And that, it should drive your worship, right? It should drive you to love the Lord more, to appreciate Him, and to see His beauty more. This is what we mean by general revelation.
I was just going to say, that is such a wonderful way to teach children.
Yes.
From when they're so little and they don't understand a whole lot, but when they're so fascinated by a flower or a weed or whatever it is, if you're pointing them to the creator of that, every single time that they're fascinated by something in God's creation, it builds such a strong foundation for them so that as they get older, and then you can utilize tools like Apologetics Press and explain the logical arguments to them as they mature and grow.
Yeah.
But it all starts way before that, and they notice the moon at night, and
Yeah.
birds and
Yeah, Veronica just pointing out how this is the strongest and probably the most powerful avenue to teach children, when you talk about God's creation, and you always want to point them to the fact that they are created things that we're seeing here, and God is the one who created them, and that starts planting that what should come natural in your mind anyway, that there is a creator and a person behind all of this design. When you were explaining that, it kind of got me to thinking that that's one of the tragedies or, the propensities of growing older, isn't it? You start to not think about those things anymore. You can drive by and you can see something on the side of the road, a dog or whatever, and it just, pretty soon, it doesn't even dawn on, or it doesn't even occur to you any longer to think about God being the creator of all the life around you and all the beauty. But children are not that way, I remember, for some reason it stands out, I don't remember if it was Josh or Jeremy, but roly-polies was just incredible to them because they could see them crawling, but then when they went to try to mess with them, they went into a little ball, and they would point, I think it was Jeremy, was pointing it out on the driveway one time. I was like, that's no big deal. No, I didn't say that. But that's maybe what we tend to do. Oh, those are roly-polies. I've seen that since I was a kid, But instead go, isn't that amazing how they... Anyway, yes?
I just posted a thing on Facebook about them because don't kill them because they eat the bad stuff in the dirt.
Okay.
That keeps the dirt cleaned out with all those.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you could point to the design of like an ecosystem or whatever, and all of that stuff that God has designed into the whole works of it all, which would be an example of what Terry's talking about there too. But it all works together because there's a logical mind and a rational mind behind it, a person who has a purpose for it all. So anyway, I know we belabored that point, but it's something that I think we should do from time to time, especially in Bible class, so that we'll be more prone to do that. Yes, Seth.
You may have said it and I missed it. In verse 18, where it says the wrath of God is revealed in heaven, do you think I don't think you're insinuating that through nature we can see that wrath. That's only revealed through the written word, right?
Well, no, I think he's saying you can see it in the plight of mankind now. So as he goes through, he says, they don't have any excuse for doing what they're doing, but they've given themselves over to it. And what you now see is God giving them over to their own lusts and their own desires. And look what they've done. They've corrupted themselves to do unnatural things, So 3 times in this chapter it says, therefore God gave them over to their uncleanness, the lusts of their hearts. And so it's the idea is we should see that God has a moral grain to his creation, and when you decide to live contrary to it, what's going to happen? You're going to destroy yourself. I mean, God, it's God's way of showing it's one of his ways of showing his wrath. Now you may be talking about his ultimate, when he comes in fury at the end of time. That's going to be an ultimate revelation of his wrath. But Paul is saying even in this world you can see God's wrath displayed against ungodliness by the corruption that results from disregarding his existence, his moral laws, and so forth. Does that help?
Yeah, I don't know that anyone that's involved with even the rest of the things mentioned here in Romans chapter 1, that they see any of God's wrath as a result of what they're doing. They don't even know that they're outside of God.
Sure.
Or that there's any, ultimate punishment coming to them.
Right.
So that's why I was wondering, I think only people who know God's word would know that wrath is there.
Yeah, I don't think Paul's point is to say everybody recognizes it as God's wrath. In fact, that's the disaster of it, is that they no longer have God in their knowledge. They don't draw those conclusions now. And so they've basically passed the point where God has given them over to it now, and they're in this vicious cycle that is going to end in utter disaster. But he's saying, are you there yet? Are you willing to consider what we're talking about here so that you can see that you don't want to live outside the moral code? Because God's wrath will also destroy you. I think that's what he's getting at. So yeah, I don't think his point is that everybody recognizes it. In fact, too many people don't, which is why they're in that circumstance. But we should. We don't have an excuse not to. Yes?
We see the wrath every day. I mean, people die. We're sick.
So death would be an example of it.
Because we are outside of God's plan.
Yes.
And if man had not rejected God in the Garden of Eden and continued on that path, we wouldn't have all the things that we're dealing with that we come to just kind of accept,
Yes.
I know myself, I said, well, that's, we're all going to die, which I know, but that's a consequence of being outside of God's grace.
Yes.
And now, if you're
Excellent.
not in God's grace, then you're in his wrath.
That's right.
And that's consequences that are...
That's what's going on. Exactly.
Exactly.
And that's why you have the language in Romans 1 that almost seems contradictory when he says they know these things, but they don't know them. Well, do they know them or do they not? Well, they don't have an excuse because what can be known of God is clearly revealed to them and all that. And then it says in verse 21, they knew God, but they didn't glorify him as God. Now their minds are so darkened that they can't recognize him. And then what about verse 28 says, they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. God gave them over. Now look at verse 32. It says, they knowing the righteous judgment of God. Do they know it or do they not? So that's that seeming tension between, listen, you're created in God's image to be a servant of God, and so these things are obvious to you, and yet now you have corrupted yourself to an extent that you're blind through God's judicial hardening of you, kind of thing. So do they know it? Do they not know it? That's how to get to the point that I think Paul is making. So let's go ahead and get into the next one because it's tied to this. So we saw the creation in chapter 1, and what you're going to see now is conscience in chapter 2. And this again is a general revelation. That is to say, it's available to every person who's a human being, because they're created in God's image with a conscience that comes equipped to discern. Now, not in every case, but in important cases, between right and wrong. And here's how he puts it. This is verse, look at verse 14, chapter 2, 14. It says, when the Gentiles, so now they're talking about people who do not have God's written law. And that's what he means by the next phrase. The Gentiles who do not have the law, that is to say the written law of Moses or the written law of God. They don't have that, but it says, by nature, they can do the things that are in the law. He goes on to say, these, although not having the written law, They are a law to themselves. Or in other words, there is a law that's in there, verse 15. They show the work of the law written in their hearts. Their conscience is bearing witness also. And between themselves, their thoughts are accusing or excusing them. So there's a lot of weighty phrases in there, but I think you can see that the general point is people don't need the Bible to recognize in many important instances the difference between right and wrong. Is that true? Because God is revealing himself to them through conscience. And it comes through natural things that happen in your life, as he says, by nature. Anybody have? I thought I saw a hand. Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Warren used in his debate against Fluke.
Yes.
A matter of conscience within someone, not a written law.
Yes, that's right. So he's talking about an old debate on the existence of God, and the Christian, Tom Warren, gave a set of true-false questions to the atheist, and was bringing up, which is one of the most widely used examples of this moral law, is the Nazi Holocaust. And it's like, now, are you willing to stand up and say that the Nazis were guilty of what is real and objectively wrong? Morally, absolutely and objectively wrong. Well, of course, who wants to stand in front of thousands of people and say, well, no, they really weren't guilty of anything that was objectively wrong. It was just subjectively wrong, like we don't like it. But that wasn't really objectively wrong. But that's what an atheist has to say if they're going to be consistent in their atheism. Because, why? The only thing that can ground morality in real and objective, in a real and objective morality is God. If there is no God, there is no objective, real morality and no objective right and wrong. There's only personal opinions and tastes. Like, I just don't like it. But what happens when the most of the people in the population begin to like it? Well, then it becomes good. See the point? And so there's no objective reality to it. Well, he's saying here that that's not the case, because there is in the conscience a repulsion toward things that are, terribly, terribly wrong, like slaughtering 6 million human beings, right? I mean, that's just, you intuit that is evil. And so, as Seth is bringing out, Warren did pose those questions, and of course, Fluke's trying to all the different ways that he could think of to try to come up with an objective morality. But of course, as an atheist, you still can't do it. He went to the laws of the courts of Nuremberg and things like that. But those are still human, man-made. Ultimately, for an atheist, they have to just be man-made laws. But Warren's point was, no, those laws are rooted in the objective standard, he says, that transcends the provincial and the transient, that is beyond borders and time, that's rooted in God. That's the only way it can be. So God exists because of this moral law. So that's what he's pointing to in these verses. Yes?
If I may.
Uh-huh.
As an atheist, I always used to say, well, I'm a good atheist. In
Okay.
other words, I'm a good person. And I used to say, if there is a God and he sees that I'm doing good, then he will excuse me. I
Okay.
think there's a lot of people out there who think that way. And if you're not, if I was never presented with this idea that there's got to be a reason that I know right from wrong.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not just something that exists for
Right.
a reason.
Yeah, a good atheist, that makes you wonder, how are you defining the word good, right? A good atheist, it could also be defined as somebody who acts and speaks consistently with atheism, which means that Flew should have stood up there and said, yeah, they were not really guilty of anything objectively wrong. We just didn't like it. That would be consistent and a good atheist, right? But there's another sense in which I think what you're meaning, good morally, like we don't try to kill people. We actually might cook for a neighbor who doesn't have any food, or we do good things like that. Now your question is, on what basis do you call that good? Is it just like, well, it's just a personal taste, it seems good to me? Well, no, if we're going to call it good in a real way, there has to be a basis for it, and that can only be God ultimately. And that's the idea there between the inconsistencies of atheism. Yeah, you don't have to be a believer in God to do good things. All that means is that you're living in God's world, where there are such a thing as good things, because He exists. But you're not living in harmony with atheism. Yeah, I think that's right. So, very good. And this is what I think Paul is talking about. It's a general revelation given to all men across all times and all places, because it's built into them. As letter A there says, there is built into man an inherent awareness of the difference between right and wrong. This is how we are able to recognize the goodness of God Himself. So if somebody was to describe to you some of God's actions and the way He thinks and feels and what He commands, how are you going to determine whether those things are good or bad? You can't just go, well, because He has the most power in the universe. That's not the definition of good. That's just a definition of somebody who has enough power to tell you what's good, right? But is there an inherent goodness? It's rooted in the nature of God, but how are we going to recognize it? Because we have been created in the image of God, and it becomes intuitive that nursing and helping and raising a child is a good thing, and killing and using and dismembering a child is evil. See what I'm saying? Those are things we can intuit because we're created in God's image. That's not to say, Seth, that we can't corrupt our thinking to the extent where we can justify some of those things in our mind. People have done, half the nation has done it, right? But that means you're resisting or suppressing the truth in your unrighteousness. So the very existence of this moral consciousness is in man reflects the moral and personal reality of God. He exists, He is good, and He is a person. He's not just a mindless force. In order for things that are done to be good, they have to be done by a person. And of course, God is the ultimate person. We know from the New Testament He's three persons, but He is the ultimate personal creator of the universe. I appreciate the comments and the class. We still didn't get through, did we? We'll probably have a new handout for next week, but I'll just finish this up at the beginning of next class on the functions. We already touched on some of them. And then we'll go from there. We're driving toward the special revelation, which is the Bible for us today. So that's where we're headed. Thank you guys so much for your attention.